So computer vision, this is a fun XKCD if you haven't seen this before. So when a user takes a photo, the app should check whether they're in a national park. Sure, easy GIS lookup, give me a few hours. And check whether it's a photo of a bird. Okay, I'll need a research team in 5 years. So computer vision started back in the 60s, and it's been a challenging problem ever since. We've made a lot of progress in recent years, but some things that will help you appreciate why something that's so easy for us as humans is challenging for a computer. You can probably look at the photo on the left and guess who it is. Anybody? Okay, Abe Lincoln, right? And there's really not a whole lot of detail in that picture, right? Our phones take a little bit better pictures than that these days, but you can see to the computer over on the right, this is just a bunch of numbers, right? So it makes it very challenging for the computer to understand this. However, even for humans, vision can be hard. Okay, you've perhaps seen a photo like this where, depending on how you look at it, you see either an older woman or a very young woman looking away from the camera, or the artist's point of view. You may have seen this photo a few years back. You know, what color is this dress really? And in this one, I don't know if you can see, there's a Dalmatian kind of in the middle, facing to the left away from the camera. So some of these things are hard even for us. This is an interesting example. If you look at the squares labeled A and B, perceptually we can tell, well, one of them is a lighter colored square, right? Well, it turns out they're actually the exact same intensity, but because of how we perceive things, we can tell, you know, there's this checkerboard pattern, and so our mind thinks, well, the B is a lot lighter, but in reality, they're exactly the same intensity. And last, something like this. This is a carefully constructed room where these people are actually the same height, but because of the way the room's constructed, it's a little bit different. So some tasks in computer vision that are common these days. One is actually came out of a project called phototourism, but you can see up on the top left a bunch of photos, and collectively these photos are analyzed and a 3D model is generated. So the one on the bottom, you can sort of see, I don't know if I can get, yeah, right. So all of these little dots down there, those are the camera locations of the original photographs were taken. And then we have this 3D model that you can actually move through. Another interesting application is augmented reality. About 10 years ago, I had a conference in Barcelona, Spain, and this is one side of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in downtown Barcelona. And at the time you couldn't, but it won't be too long before you can imagine taking your phone and clicking on certain parts of the image. You know, click on a particular part, and when you look at the towers up at the top, it turns out that this cathedral has been under construction for 100 years, and it's actually, I think in the next 10 to 15 years, they're going to finish this final tower that's going to be the tallest of all three. But you could imagine kind of putting your phone up and kind of visualizing what that would look like as you're at the bottom, even though it's not finished yet. And of course, if you go there, you have to see the inside. It's just absolutely amazing. The stained glass, the architecture, one of my favorite places I've ever visited. Also, we have a lot of sensors that are analyzing things that we do. So for example, you can interact with an Xbox using a Kinect, right? And there's a lot of computer vision behind it that's actually making that work. Self-driving cars, we see these in various parts of the world, increasingly in the US, but some parts of the world, these are kind of standard on the road these days. And the way that a self-driving car works is most often not by a camera, but by LiDAR, which essentially is sweeps a bunch of lasers around and can tell where things are relative to the car itself. Also, robotics are dependent on computer vision. You can see some applications here. I have a colleague at BYU who, you may have seen the movie Big Hero 6, but he's actually working on inflatable robotics. It's a really interesting area, up and coming future area, where things are more compliant and less likely to hurt people by accident. Also, Amazon Go. Okay, the whole store is basically run by computer vision. Here's another interesting little XKCD. It's often hard to get small subjects very good photos, but this is an alternative way to do it with a webcam. So the area I work in within computer vision is called object recognition. And a few of you may recognize who this is. This is a basketball player named Jimmer Fredette who played for BYU a number of years ago. Most recently, he played in Shanghai for the Shanghai Sharks. But I created this when I was giving a talk in China, and object recognition has a number of different sort of facets to it. One is detection, namely where in an image are objects. Another part is we may want to know what those individuals are doing, so we need to understand their pose. Here you can tell, Jimmer is holding the basketball right now, and you can tell that in part because of his pose. So that's something we call pose estimation. That's an important part of recognition. And then ultimately classification, we want to know who we have in an image or what, and perhaps even what they're doing. I see this as a spectrum. We have, so if you look at things on the left, what would you call those two things on the left? Frog and piano, right? Pretty easy. On the right-hand side, sort of on the opposite end of the categorization spectrum, we have sort of basic level categories on the left. And on the right, we have, two different people. So this would be sort of like biometrics. Can you tell who either of those are just by the hairlines? Okay, when I made the slides, made this particular slide a little while ago. So it's George Bush on the left and Barack Obama on the right. And I think if in that moment of time, it was probably a little easier. If I did Trump and Biden today, it'd probably be a little easier to tell. But so on the left, again, we have basic level categories. On the right, we have subordinate categories or even biometrics. In the middle is the area where my research group does most of its work. When you see these two silhouettes, you probably don't say bird and bird. What would you call them? Penguin and owl, right? These are what psychologists call entry-level categories. So they're not bird and bird, but as we go even more detailed, we look at a particular bird and the markings on its head allow us to tell a white-breasted nuthatch from a red-breasted nuthatch. Okay, and so when we get to the subordinate level categories, we're looking for very subtle differences to identify categorize exactly what we're looking at. So some examples we have are this basic level categorization problem. These days, there's a big data set called ImageNet. It's been around for about 12 years. On the opposite extreme, we have a variety of smaller data sets, for example, that allow us to try to identify individual whales by the fluke patterns or salamanders. I'll talk about some other ones during my talk. And last, here's an example. This is one of the larger bird data sets. This one has 200 different species, and basically trying to train a computer to identify which of those 200 species a given image is. So to help you appreciate this problem, one, you probably don't see too many pictures that look like this. This is what we would see if we had sort of a film negative, right? From sort of when I grew up, we had these actual film negatives, right? But to the computer, this is exactly the same as the images that we might see, which look like this. So looking at this image in the top left, here's 8 different species of birds. And to see if you can tell, most of you are online on Zoom. Usually I have people here in the room that we can kind of say how many think it's this one and so forth. Anybody have an idea which one they think the bird in the top left is? They all look pretty similar. These are all sparrows, which are, very similar family. They're pretty drab brown for the most part. This one is actually the one down there along the bottom. And once you know it, you can kind of look and see certain things like there's sort of a reddishness on the wings that some of the others don't have, the stripe right behind the eye. There's various characteristics that are highly localized, but allow you to tell which of those 8 that it is. So in nature, we have a lot of these. Another family of birds that's common in the US is called the warbler family. And so you can see a whole bunch of them that all look, there's some of them that look very similar, right? You have some of them that are yellow, some of them are more gray, but there's a lot of similarity between them and they're difficult to tell apart. Another place we see, anybody know what these are? This is a natural setting. These are spider eyes, okay? Different types of spiders have different patterns. And I didn't know this, but some spiders actually don't have 8 eyes. you can see, for example, I'll do it here so everyone's in to see it too, but like these ones down here, right? Those only have 6. And we're trying to see if we can get the camera to track. There we go. Try not to go too far because I don't think they'll hear me if I'm too far from my laptop. But
Let's project.
okay, yeah. There we go. Okay, so you can see me now if I move. Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Okay, so some other domains. Again, birds from a different view, sort of by the silhouette and the shape, allows you to tell what type of hawk or raptor we have. And there's also differences in the appearance, but man-made domains. Shoes, both men's and women's. I didn't know there are this many different types of men's shoes, and I certainly didn't know the women's side either, but food's another really difficult one. There's been some work that food, trying to identify what type of food you might have in a picture. You can imagine there's certain apps that will try to tell you how many calories just by taking a picture of it. So I'm going to tell you about some of the work we've done in my lab. Some of my early work had to do with a paradigm called post-normalization. Explain what that is. So Herb Biederman, a psychologist, I guess 35 years ago now, came up with this theory called recognition by components. And if you look at these images, you can, from even a fraction of the object's silhouettes, begin to tell what they are. So those in the room, like anybody, can you tell any of those 5 just by the front of the silhouette? Shout it out if you can. I'll give you a little bit more if not. How about now? Okay, so up, something like that. What about the next one? Oh, any of them?
So scissors and like a stool.
Okay, scissors and stool, and then I'll show you the other. But, what the theory is that what you can begin to recognize, these first two, see if we can follow it. Yeah. So these first two columns, they have the exact same amount of information as far as how, like, the length of the contours. Where they are is kind of important. The intersections allow you to kind of see more of the three-dimensional structure. You can see that these objects are kind of composed of, cylinders, in some cases, straighter, sort of more box-like things, and how those things are configured, called the one on the left a briefcase, the one on the right, like a drawer, right? Or similarly, a mug or a paint can, but sort of, as far as the components that make these up, they're the same, it's just how they're configured that allows you to tell what the object is. So using this idea, we abstracted, here's an example of the penguin. We basically turned a bird into its two most prominent sort of volumetric parts. And we represented them with ellipses, one for the head and one for the body. So here's an example image where the body ellipsoid might look something like that. And we can actually take and extract the pixels and project them onto the surface of the ellipsoid and get something that looks like that for this particular image. Similarly for the head. So we have these two three-dimensional volumetric objects. And we take the pixels in the image and projected them onto where we think they are. And that will allow us to, in other images, by comparing sort of the surface of the ellipsoids, recognize the birds. So here's an example. That's that one picture. Here's a different species, same family. These are both vireos. And you can see the bodies pretty similar. As we extract others, viewed from all kinds of different angles, you can still see some of the patterns like these two white wing bars. Right? They show up in the same place consistently across the ellipsoid. And that's not quite as distinctive between these two species. You can see a little bit more yellow on the top species sometimes, but when you look at the head, this bird has a dark eye with a white ring around it. This one has a white eye and yellow around it. Okay? So by knowing exactly where the head is and how it's oriented, it allows us to discriminate between these two much more effectively. So the method that we use to do this is, given an image, we're going to take a random rectangle, and across other images, we sort of have annotations that tell us where the bird is and where different parts of it, its eye, its feet, its wings, and so forth. But we essentially are going to extract analogous regions from a bunch of other images in our training data. And when we align them, we sort of see kind of a similar pose relative to the rectangle. So, if you average those images together, you get something like this. You can kind of see what part of a bird this might be. And we extract some features that allow the computer to tell this image, this sort of regions look like this from a bunch of random regions and other images that are not birds. And so we get a bunch of these sort of templates. And there was some work that was called poselets. It was for human pose. And so we called these birdlets. And so you can see two particular ones. You don't see a lot of red on them. And that's because these sort of naturally clustered from a songbird called the vireo family. And you can see these ones down here. If you're familiar with birds, these are representative more of woodpeckers and kind of poses that you see woodpeckers in. So using these, we use those templates to estimate where each sort of template votes for the orientation location of the body and head. And given those, we can extract appearance features from the surface of those estimated ellipsoids. And then we use that to classify and predict which species it is. So I'm going to go a little quickly through this part, but basically, again, we take sort of parts on the surface of the ellipsoid, estimate what the pixels from the image would show up on that part. So in this case, kind of like a location around where the eye would be. And then we use that to extract a feature, couple its location on the ellipsoid, and that's what we're going to use to do our recognition, a bunch of these. And for those that are familiar with random forests, we originally did this with random forests, that you could use different things now. And so a random forest basically is a decision tree where a particular feature, there's at each of these nodes sort of a decision made that's relative to a threshold. And so as we build this tree, we have our features that, for example, this particular feature might fall into there, and that's going to suggest that that's likely of the green species, right? This one may end up in a different bin and vote for the red species. But as you accumulate these across a bunch of different features, it tells you which species it's most likely to be. So you add that up across them and figure out that's what you're probably looking at. So that was early work we did that's very geometric. I like that idea, but the idea is to pose normalize. Whatever view you're looking at the bird from really doesn't matter, because you can just map the information onto the surface of the sort of a canonical bird. So this is another work that has more to do with pose estimation. And you can see here a bunch of different bird species. We're going to take, there's a method called proof. We didn't come up with this one, but the idea was to take two different species, so the red one on the top and the blue one on the bottom, and get a bunch of training data, and then essentially look at in each of those where two different points are. So it might be the beak and the back of the head, okay? And so given those across the training data, actually it looks like, sorry, I had that backwards, is the eye and the sort of the nape right behind the head. But it allows us to line these all up again and learn something that's going to be aligned to those particular points. Okay, to be a little more clear, I think the figure that we use is a little clearer, but I'm going to skip to that. So here you can see, if we take, for example, the eye, a bunch of different images might show up at this one, beating out that one, right, the breast and the belly, the left leg and the tail. But you can see on these images on the left how we're sort of grabbing the appropriate regions. Can actually align it to the pose of the object. It might be a bird in flight, might be a bird that's perched. But doing this, we need to be able to figure out where those key points are. And top rows, we do a pretty good job. The green ones are big down through. The red ones are down through, the black ones, the ones we estimate, and the green lines are kind of the offset. You can see at the bottom, there's a few things it struggles with, such as left and right in that middle one. But based on that, You can see a bunch of other methods that ultimately are trying to classify what type of bird it is. And our method is significantly better. At the time, it was the best. A few years old, so other methods have now exceeded that. Okay, another area that we've been working in is animal biometrics. So here's an image that was taken in India. I have a collaborator who works with the Wildlife Institute of India, and I believe it's 4 years, they do a census of the tigers in India, trying to count how many there are because they're highly threatened. And they have what they call camera traps. People use them throughout the world with essentially a camera mounted on the side of a tree or something like that. And when an animal passes in front of it, it takes a photo. And they've set these up throughout the national parks in India. And they're trying to know how many unique tigers there are, simply by taking the hundreds of thousands of photos that get taken over a long period of time. And then basically saying, have we seen this one yet? Have we seen this one? Which one is it? And it's a painful process for humans to do, so we'd like to automate it. And so here might be, a close-up of the flank of one tiger. And we want to know which of the 3 tigers, but in reality, it's not 3. I can put 3 on the slide, but there are hundreds and ultimately thousands of unique tigers throughout India, but only a few thousand, 2,000 or 3,000. So that's the problem. The same problem in animal biometrics. This is a project trying to identify jaguars, how many individual jaguars there are, keeping track of giraffes, turtles, whale sharks, manta rays. There's a bunch of animals that have sort of unique patterns that allow you to tell which individual it is, not just, this is a whale shark, but which whale shark. And, you might observe a whale shark on one side of the ocean and months later observe it on the other side. You can kind of learn from that. So the way that we've recently, this is still kind of preliminary. We've been working on this problem for a while, but haven't had as promising results until recently. But what we do is we take the image, the flank of the tiger, and the detection problem is something that is largely solved. So we can find where the tiger is and then extract its flank. But essentially, we're looking at the image gradients, which are simply contrast areas between lighter and darker regions. So you can kind of see that it finds the stripes pretty well just by looking at the gradient. And we then essentially are looking for the stripe endpoints, so places where there's, better if I just walk over. You can sort of see the endpoint here where it starts coming down, the endpoint up, and ultimately we sort of are moving to their patterns. And this tells us the areas that are sort of reddish or even bright. Also dark red. Most likely areas. In this case, we're looking for the down endpoints of the stripe. And so it allows us to extract, in this case, the dots. Right? And so to characterize this particular tiger by stripes that end at the blue locations going down, the yellow locations going up, and even the red ones, a little harder to see, but this one's kind of like a Y, there's stripes. Right? Part of an M, maybe. Okay. So that's work that we've been doing recently. And then, of course, the idea is you do this for a bunch of images and are looking for patterns that go over. We're going to be using graph neural networks, which are they're super useful and promising. And so we think we're going to be able to do better than any of the previous methods have done at this problem, either for tigers or for a number of other. We have some collaborators in Europe as well that are doing other patterned carnivores. So that's some current work on animal biometrics. Another area we're working on is what I like to think of as recognition at small scales. Sometimes hard, and I show you that picture of the little bird and getting close to it, but anybody have an idea of what this organism is? So this is called a sea slug. They're technically called nudibranchs. But I was wandering around. I was actually looking for these happening on. You can see my younger two sons over there on the right looking down and kind of pointing at it. But this is a nudibranch. It's called an opalescent nudibranch. It's a beautiful animal. Nudibranchs tend to be very, very colorful. They're found all over the world and have a huge variation in what they actually look like. But if you came across this, you likely wouldn't know what it was. If you wanted to, you could take a picture and then using fine grained recognition, learn what it is. Another example, this is a view from a trail that I often hike, probably about once a week. Right near home is the mouth of the trail. The trailhead is like 5 minutes from BYU campus. Beautiful area. And the other day I was walking along and a butterfly that came and sort of flew and settled down on the trail. And I had never seen this one alive. I knew about it. But as I tried to get closer and closer, you can imagine yourself seeing something walking along the trail, trying to get closer and ultimately taking a picture. And then you're trying to figure out what is it? What type of butterfly is it? Where are these common? Is this uncommon in my region? And it turns out this one I had never seen in 9 years of walking. I don't walk the trail. It was actually a COVID thing. There's only 2 years I've been doing it on a weekly basis. I started hiking this trail. But I'd never seen this particular species. It turns out it only comes out a particular time of year for a couple of weeks. And that's when you're likely to see it. And also it's often up at the treetops. And that's maybe been there all along and I just never saw it. But here's a set of butterfly specimens. One of the things that work at university, you probably have a similar thing here at Boise State where you have kind of collect specimens for the biologists to work on. And so we have, I don't know how many different specimens of butterflies, but the curator put together this tray of about 50 different common through the Rockies. So many of these you probably find here in Boise as well. One of the things that we've done early in this work was, you can probably see on the right hand side there, those are GoPro cameras. I think we're now on the GoPro 11. These are like user force, so this is not quite as feature rich as the current ones. But basically this film was built on PVC pipes and has, in the picture you can see 16 of them. Eventually we added another 10 around the base, so there were 26 cameras looking from different angles. And we would use this to capture. We would use this to capture images. In this case, we had a praying mantis that we put inside and took pictures from a bunch of different angles. Part of this was in order to recognize an animal from a bunch of different angles, we need to know what it looks like from a bunch of different angles. So we're collecting this data, and this worked pretty well. But it requires you to capture the specimen and put it in there, and we were actually going to observe it as it moved around and stuff to get lots of different poses. It was a little challenging, but we ended up with a different setup. This is one of my grad students, Suguru, and you can sort of see in the middle there. But we have currently 8 high-resolution cameras. The white boxes are projectors. One projects the dominant. Our able to take, again, from that tray of specimens the curator shared with us, we're going to, once we're done with those, we can go out and get additional specimens of different species. But he's built this capture setup so that photograph butterfly from different angles, but also capture its geometry. Maybe capture its geometry is kind of cool. Vector essentially projects a pattern of alternating white and black lines. That's very carefully taken pictures set up. It's about a second. Each of these frames that we're seeing now is a picture. And so there's the sequence at any given location, you can imagine you're at one spot. It's going to, at any given moment of time, it's either going to be black or white. So that forms a fit sequence that allows us to uniquely identify each of the locations on the object. And so here is an example. This is sort of quantized. I think he has basically essentially all these different uniquely identified points. Along with this geometric information, which we get both for the bottom surface and the top surface. We also get these high resolution cameras and special lights. So this is a data set that we're building, and ultimately we're probably about a month from having all the data collected, and then going to use a relatively new technique called NERF, which stands for neural radiance fields. And essentially is a deep learning model that allows you to take a small set of images and train the model so that it can basically generate images from other angles. And that will be helpful in understanding what this object looks like from a bunch of different angles. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to share. I think most of you are PhD or graduate students, master students. And I want to share with you something that my first graduate student and I had an experience, an important lesson that we learned about success. So you'll recall this film we were using training this. We also, part of the vision was we would do this with a bunch of different things. I talked about recognition of birds and tigers, things like that. But also, in our field, we also try to recognize things like cars, understand the make and model of cars. So we basically, by just making the pipes longer, to make these stones bigger and put a car inside it. And so the first time we actually tested this out outside, we did a bunch of work with insects inside, and that was like a 2-foot dome. And so we drove, this is just my personal car, we drove it in there, and this is me kind of looking up, my student looking down, and he's trying to, after we drove it in, put the last camera back in place. So you can watch and see, putting it back in, so it's like basically one picture, and it's not even moving. One picture from each camera. But we're doing that. That represented, you know, not just the time that it took to assemble. That was a couple hours it took to assemble the dome. But each of these is like a 3D printed joint that took 10, 12 hours. And we're broken in the process of that all coming down. Fortunately, the GoPro is actually fairly scratched. So good endorsement for GoPro. You know, that was really, really deflating. Really frustrating to have that happen, all the time that we'd invested in it. And, you know, the plan was we were going to get pictures of this car, move it out, bring in another one, and keep doing this. And so this was, you know, kind of an epic fail. I want to look at it that way. But what it led us to do is to think, you know, we realized, okay, it's going to be about probably another 6 to 8 weeks before we can reprint all those parts and redo it. And so we tried to think, are there other ways that we could do it? And we ended up coming up with this, which we still use the GoPro. And basically, these are 3-foot diameter balloons, which it takes 4 3-foot diameter balloons plus a little bit of apparatus to kind of keep it in the right orientation. Yeah, it could, but we have a fishing wire to make sure it doesn't float away. But in essence, we did this, and so we, this is the BYU football stadium. Boise would be blue on the field. But basically, there's a big parking lot next to it. And so what we did is we would walk up one side of the aisle of cars, walk down the other. And so to see up here, that's where it's calculated where it's taken. As much transit traffic. So actually, only where the cameras were, but again, so 3D model, 25 of what it observed. And so this allowed us to, you can see up here in the top left, this is a view from the camera up on the balloons. And then down here, that's my car again, with a bunch of cameras sort of get a pole on the side of the car. So the different elevation angles. But one of the cameras from the car. So what we get is we get overhead of the vehicles, which is actually the part that is really important to us. And then we actually also can see the license plates. Turns out there's a public database which you can search the actual license plate. Look it up, query that through the license plate, and it'll tell you, well, that particular car is a Nissan Altima. You can actually see there, like, and we captured lots and lots of vehicles in a very short amount of time and are able to figure out what vehicle it is, but then get those over the vehicle. It's hard to tell, you know, that's your car expert, which I'm not. And so this turned out to be, you know, allowed us to rather quickly with probably 3 or 4 different days of like this. It helped when we did it when there was actually a football game or something like that because more people were playing. But we got about 20 to 25 different views. You can see here sort of different angles. A total about 100,000 views. Think about how long that would have taken with our original setup had it not broken. Driving one car in, taking one out. So the lesson that I learned from this is, I think failure is an inherent part of the research process. But if you're persistent and patient, it will lead to success. I think sometimes that failure without that, in this case, if we hadn't had the dome break, we probably would have continued inefficiently driving cars in and out. So hopefully for each of you in your research, don't be disappointed when things don't work out. Okay, if you have failures, even epic failures like we did, right, it can actually lead to something that ends up being much more a better approach to it. So thank you.